On October the 27th, 1962, on a Russian submarine, the order was given to fire a nuclear torpedo at an American ship. 3 men had essentially made the decision to begin the world's first nuclear war. Fortunately for all of us, the order wasn't carried out. At the last minute, the captain changed his mind and the decision was taken not to launch the nuclear weapon. That episode is just one of many moments when the world has come within a whisker of an all-out nuclear war. Given how close it was, one can't help but wonder what would have happened if the order had been executed. If a nuclear torpedo was fired at those American ships, what would they have done? How would the situation have escalated? Was humanity actually on the verge of extinction in those tense moments? In this video, I'm going to speculate on those questions. Of course, we can't know exactly how things would have played out, but it's certainly interesting to think about what might have been. However, before that, let's have an overview of what did happen, the history of the Cold War and the arms race between America and the Soviet Union. In August of 1945, nuclear weapons were used for the first time in human history when the United States dropped bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The 2 nuclear bombs caused so much destruction that they forced Japan to surrender, ending World War II. For the next 4 years, America was the only nation with nuclear capabilities, allowing it to dominate global geopolitics. However, that dominance was soon to be challenged by its former ally, the Soviet Union. Relations between the US and the Soviet Union had been rapidly worsening since 1945. The 2 superpowers were founded on incompatible ideologies. The US supported democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union promoted communism and dictatorship. That ideological divide led to what became known as the Cold War, a tense period of political and military rivalry that stretched from 1945 to 1991. The stakes of the conflict rose dramatically in August of 1949 when the Soviet Union successfully detonated its own nuclear bomb, ending America's monopoly on nuclear weapons. At first, the nuclear arsenals of the 2 superpowers were relatively limited, but by the early 1950s, both nations were increasing their stockpiles. America initially had superiority with about 1,000 nuclear warheads by 1953, far more than the Soviet Union. However, the balance of power shifted in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. The significance of that went beyond space exploration. In developing Sputnik, the Soviet Union had developed a powerful rocket which was also capable of functioning as an intercontinental ballistic missile. That meant that they now had the ability to launch a nuclear strike from its own territory onto the US mainland. However, that advantage was short-lived as America developed its own intercontinental ballistic missile the next year. That technological race led to an arms race where both sides rapidly expanded their nuclear arsenals. Then, in 1962, the world came very close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm going to talk a lot more about the Cuban Missile Crisis later, but basically the Soviet Union stationed missiles on Cuba, and in response, America blockaded the island. The situation was extremely tense, and nuclear war was only just avoided. The Cuban Missile Crisis highlighted the dangers of nuclear war between the superpowers, making it clear that they had to find a way to coexist. That led to a treaty that banned the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. The treaty was meant to slow the arms race, but the Soviet Union continued to increase its arsenal, and by the mid-1970s, it had as many warheads as America. At that point, both nations had about 20,000 warheads each, more than enough to destroy the planet. In an attempt to stop the arms race, the 2 sides agreed to more treaties. In the Second SALT Treaty, they agreed to reductions in their nuclear arsenals. However, the treaty was never ratified by the US Senate because the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. That would turn into a major proxy war. The Soviet Union sent over 500,000 troops to support the communist Afghan government, while the US backed the Muslim guerrilla opposition, the Mujahideen. The war went extremely badly for the Soviets, which showed how weak they were. Then American President Ronald Reagan increased military spending, forcing the Soviets to do the same. His plan was to push the weak Soviet economy into collapse, and it worked extremely well. By the mid-80s, the country was in a dire economic state. A new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, tried to introduce reforms to improve the situation by allowing free markets and democratic elections and withdrawing from Afghanistan. However, his reforms came too late. By that point, many of the Soviet member states wanted independence and the Union began to fall apart. Eventually, in 1991, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved, ending the Cold War. With that, the threat of nuclear war was greatly reduced. So, that is what happened. There were many close shaves, but the world avoided nuclear war. So what might have happened if the Cold War did turn hot? I think the best way to try to work out what might have happened is by looking at some of the moments that it almost did. In particular, I want to take a closer look at two events where things almost escalated. The first is the Cuban Missile Crisis that I mentioned earlier. That stands out as one of the Cold War's most perilous moments. The crisis began when the Soviet Union secretly deployed missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American coast. American spy planes discovered the missiles, leading President Kennedy to impose a naval blockade to prevent further Soviet shipments. The whole way through the crisis, the world was on the brink of nuclear war, but there was one moment in particular that I want to focus on. It happened on October the 27th, when some American ships detected a Soviet nuclear-armed submarine near Cuba. They tried to force the submarine to surface by using depth charges. Understandably, the Soviet crew thought that they were under attack. Panicked and unable to communicate with Moscow, the submarine's captain ordered the activation of the nuclear torpedo. To launch the torpedo, the captain needed the approval of two senior officers aboard the submarine, both of whom agreed to fire. However, at the last minute, the captain hesitated and ultimately decided against launching the nuclear torpedo. The submarine surfaced shortly afterwards and returned to Soviet waters. The world had avoided a nuclear exchange only because one single Soviet official had decided against it at the last minute. If he had been a different person or even just in a different mood, that nuclear torpedo might have been launched. The Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved a few days later. The Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for the US promising not to invade Cuba and removing missiles that it had in Turkey. Overall, the crisis was an extremely close shave and is regarded as perhaps the most critical moment in the Cold War. The next time that there was such a perilous moment was 21 years later. It happened on September the 26th, 1983, and involved a Soviet military official named Stanislav Petrov, who was on duty at the Soviet Union's Missile Defense Command Center. He was monitoring the early warning system, which the Soviets had installed to track fast-moving objects. All of a sudden, the system activated, indicating that the US had launched 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles at the Soviet Union. Petrov was faced with an incredibly difficult decision. Should he alert his superiors and launch a retaliatory strike, or hesitate and try to work out whether it was a false alarm? Petrov had only a matter of minutes to decide what to do. The protocol dictated that he was supposed to escalate, but Petrov had doubts about the reliability of the system. It was reporting just 5 missiles, which seemed far too small to be a deliberate American attack. If the US was going to launch a nuclear barrage, surely it would be much larger than just 5 missiles. That inconsistency made him think that the alarm might have been a malfunction, so he chose to defy his orders and not report it. His decision was absolutely crucial. Had he reported the warning, the Soviet Union might have launched a retaliatory nuclear strike. Petrov was later proven correct. The warning had indeed been a false alarm caused by a malfunction in the system. It had mistakenly detected the sun's reflection off clouds as a missile launch. Once again, it had come down to the lucky decision of one man to prevent nuclear war. So hopefully now you have a better sense of the type of event that might have sparked an escalation. Now for the question of the video, what would it have actually looked like if such an escalation happened? Before we speculate about that, I'd like to take a minute to emphasize just how unpredictable the whole thing would have been. The sheer number of unknown unknowns is enormous. For example, one thing that would have massively affected how things played out would have been the personalities of the leaders involved. How a leader acts in a moment of crisis can be very unpredictable. For example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev was very aggressive in his rhetoric. That contrasts sharply with Kennedy, who was more measured and composed. Someone who was absolutely mental was Fidel Castro. He actually sent a letter to Khrushchev urging him to start a nuclear war. Something else that would have made the situation unpredictable is that there would have been errors. The technology of the time was very unreliable, and there would have been human error. Another problem was that communication was very slow. It took hours for messages to travel between Washington and Moscow. Overall, exactly how things would have played out is completely unknowable. Before we speculate on how things might have escalated, I'd like to spend a minute on one thing that we do know, which is what position the two sides were in. In particular, I'm talking about what their nuclear capabilities were. Where on the globe could they hit with a nuclear warhead? How easy was it for them to do so? Both powers had multiple ways of delivering nuclear warheads, including bombs dropped from aircraft, submarine-launched missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and shorter-range missiles. Each of those methods had advantages and disadvantages. For example, dropping bombs from aircraft was by far the cheapest method, but had the disadvantage that the plane could be shot down. Intercontinental ballistic missiles could strike distant targets, but they were very expensive and had fixed launch sites that could be destroyed. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles were good because they were mobile and difficult to neutralize, but early models were inaccurate and had limited range. Finally, shorter-range missiles had the obvious disadvantage that they needed to be close to the target, but were cheaper and easier to produce than long-range missiles. So what position were both sides in during the Cold War? How many of each type of weapon did they have? Of course, the answer is very complicated because it changed a lot throughout the war. Let's have a look at how things looked during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. At that point, the United States had a significant advantage, having more of every type of nuclear weapon. In total, America possessed about 25,000 nuclear warheads, of which about 3,500 could be launched immediately. The Soviet Union was in a far weaker position, with only about 3,500 warheads in total, of which about 300 were ready to launch. The Americans also had many more of the most important weapons, the intercontinental ballistic missiles. They had about 170, while the Soviet Union had less than 75. America also had a big advantage in terms of warheads dropped from planes. They could use their large fleet of long-range bombers to target anywhere in the Soviet Union. The Soviets, on the other hand, would have struggled to get a bomber over mainland America because the American Air Force was so much better than theirs. Overall, the Americans could easily strike virtually anywhere in the Soviet Union, which wasn't the case in reverse. It was to address exactly that imbalance that the Soviet Union wanted to station missiles on Cuba. That would bring most American cities within range of its shorter-range missiles. That is how the situation looked in the early 1960s, but as the Cold War progressed, it changed significantly. Essentially, by the 70s and 80s, the Soviets were able to catch up with the Americans and get to a position where they could hit anywhere in America with ICBMs. They also managed to match the total number of warheads that the Americans had. One final thing that I want to talk about before considering some actual scenarios is what the goals of each side would have been. What would they have been trying to achieve in a nuclear war? I can think of three main things that they would have been focused on: security, saving face, and the potential for nuclear supremacy. By security, I mean simply to minimize the danger to their nation in the long run. Both sides were, of course, desperate that their cities couldn't be hit by the other's nukes. The Soviet Union would also have been concerned about the prospect of an invasion from Western Europe. By saving face, I mean that they wouldn't want to look weak. That would be both to maintain deterrence and also to appease their populations. Any leader would know that if they handled the situation badly and left their country humiliated, they would almost certainly lose power. Finally, both sides would have been considering the possibility that they could achieve nuclear supremacy. By that I mean the possibility of totally neutralizing the nuclear arsenal of the other side, leaving them as the only one with nuclear weapons. Needless to say, that would have been the ultimate prize. If one side achieved that, the Cold War would have been over, and whichever side had the nukes would have been able to impose almost any terms that it wanted on the other. So, with all that context out the way, let's finally consider how things might have actually played out. To try to tackle the question, I'm going to outline a few different scenarios and speculate on how likely I think they were to happen. First, let's talk about the potential for rapid de-escalation. For me, this is actually the most likely way that things would have played out. It's important to remember that neither side wanted nuclear war. Even after a small nuclear exchange, the simple logic of mutually assured destruction would still have applied. Every sane person would have desperately sought ways to de-escalate the situation as soon as possible. So, how might things have played out during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Suppose that the Soviet submarine crew did launch a nuclear torpedo at the American Navy. How might the situation unfold from there? Well, we can be sure that the nuclear warhead would annihilate the entire American fleet. That included 1 aircraft carrier and 11 destroyers, meaning that thousands of Americans would have been killed instantly. For me, it's almost impossible to imagine that the Americans wouldn't retaliate in some way. I mentioned earlier that both sides were concerned with saving face and not humiliating their country. For America to suffer a nuclear strike and not retaliate would have seemed incredibly weak, and it simply wouldn't have been tolerated by the American people. The most logical thing for America to do would be an immediate invasion of Cuba to destroy the Soviet missile sites there. That would have both saved face and done a lot to improve America's security situation. Cuba being allied with the Soviets was perhaps the biggest security risk that America had. It's almost certain that America would have taken control of the island as soon as possible. I think if the situation was going to de-escalate quickly, it likely would have come after that. The Soviet Union would almost certainly have had to offer a quick apology, recognizing its catastrophic mistake. Then the two superpowers might have entered into an agreement to make sure that such an incident would never happen again. Now let's consider what might have happened if things didn't de-escalate so quickly. There are many reasons that might have been the case. Hardliners in Moscow might have argued that the US was trying to exploit the situation to invade Cuba and that Russia should respond by targeting an American ally. Two logical targets would have been West Berlin or the NATO missile bases in Turkey. Even if the Soviets didn't react like that, the situation could have escalated further if the Americans wanted to do more than just invade Cuba. They would have just suffered a nuclear strike and might be determined to respond in kind. If the Americans did decide to retaliate using nuclear weapons, I think we can be certain that the strike would have been extremely limited. It would have had to walk a fine line, being just large enough to save face and re-establish deterrence, but escalating the situation as little as possible. I think we can be absolutely certain that their target would have been purely military, and they would not have done anything that would have killed a large number of Soviet civilians. They certainly wouldn't have simply nuked a city. I think a plausible target would have been a military installation close to Europe in Western Russia. Such an attack might still have resulted in thousands of casualties and enormous devastation. Potentially then, the two sides would have seen sense and started de-escalating. Up until then, the Soviet Union might have doubted whether the Americans would actually launch nuclear strikes against them, thinking that they would be too cautious. Once that assumption was proven wrong, the Soviet Union would have to reconsider and back down. In the aftermath of the crisis, the world would have been in a state of absolute shock, with both superpowers realizing what a close shave it had been. Again, there would almost certainly have been agreements made, potentially similar to the 1963 Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, but with even stricter measures. The two sides might even have started to disarm. So, what might have happened if things didn't de-escalate from there? In my opinion, the next logical step would be for the Soviet Union to try to do something in Europe. After all, the greatest security threat to Moscow was the NATO missiles in Western Europe and Turkey. If the Soviet Union could neutralize those, it would drastically improve its security situation. It would be much harder to target it with nukes, and it would be extremely well protected from an invasion with conventional forces. Also, capturing those territories would give it a much better position in a negotiation. I think the first target would have been West Berlin, followed by Greece or Turkey. The Soviet Union did actually have a plan to conquer Western Europe. In 1964, a blueprint was made by the Soviet General Staff, which included reaching Lyon in France in just 9 days. At the heart of the plan was speed. The Soviet planners argued that the best option was a rapid and overwhelming offensive, since NATO didn't have that many ground forces there. They did think that NATO would resort to small or tactical nuclear weapons to halt their advance. That said, they thought that they would be fairly cautious, wanting to minimize civilian casualties. Also, the Soviets had a lot of confidence in their air defenses, thinking that they would be able to shoot down NATO's missiles. So how might the invasion have played out? Obviously, it's impossible to know, but what we do know is that the Soviets were actually correct in some of their assumptions. First, they did have far more conventional forces in Europe than NATO. In 1952, NATO had just 25 divisions ready for combat, compared with the Soviet Union's 140, a nearly six-fold difference. That would have meant that the only way for NATO and America to stop the Soviet invasion would have been with heavy reliance on tactical nuclear weapons. They were also correct to think that it would have been a race against time. As soon as they started the invasion, American forces would have been sent en masse to Europe. The longer the fighting lasted, the greater the chance that the Soviet Union would have lost. Like with everything else in this video, we can't know exactly how it would have played out. What we can be sure of is that there would have been immense destruction. After all, if NATO was using tactical nuclear weapons, the Soviets would have done the same. Tens of millions of people would have been left homeless and starving, with vital infrastructure obliterated. Europe would have been totally destroyed. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Prague might have been completely erased from the map, while others such as Amsterdam and Paris would likely have suffered huge damage, perhaps becoming uninhabitable from radiation. That said, even in such a serious scenario, I still think both powers would have been reluctant to use large nuclear weapons on civilian targets. The risk of massive retaliation and global condemnation was simply too great, and direct hits on civilians would still have been taboo. The nuclear weapons used would have been small, so-called tactical nuclear weapons, essentially used like traditional artillery, only significantly more powerful. So, who would have won the battle? In the long run, I think NATO would probably have won, but it wouldn't have been easy. For example, air superiority would have been fiercely contested. NATO did have technological superiority, with slightly more advanced aircraft and sophisticated radar systems, but the Soviet Union would have been able to rely on sheer numbers. The Soviets also had an extensive network of surface-to-air missiles in Eastern Europe. Overall, the Soviet Union would probably have had air superiority, at least at the beginning. They would also have had an advantage with logistics, simply because they were so much closer to the fighting. However, as they advanced further west, that advantage would have been lost. At the time, America would have been getting reinforcements to Europe as fast as possible and organizing a counterattack. Western Europe's advanced infrastructure would have helped them get troops and supplies to the front. In the end, I think the outcome of the battle would have mainly depended on NATO's ability to withstand the Soviet Union's initial attack and deploy its forces quickly. That conflict in Europe would have had global repercussions. There would have been an enormous financial crisis and a deep recession. Fighting might also have kicked off in other areas of the world. All throughout the Cold War, there were numerous proxy wars, and those could have been affected. A good example is Korea. Korea was split between the North, aligned with the Soviets, and the South, aligned with America. Fighting in the Korean War had ended in 1953, but a peace treaty had never been signed. If there was a hot war in Europe, one of those two governments could have used it as an opportunity to invade the other. Something similar could have happened in numerous other areas, such as Vietnam, Taiwan, or the Middle East. So how might the conflict have ended? I think the most likely outcome would have been that NATO was able to stall the Soviet advance in Europe, and then both sides would start to de-escalate. The Soviet Union would be in a position where it was unable to make progress on the ground. The Americans probably would have been able to advance into Russia, but would have been wary of doing so, as it would leave Moscow with no choice but to use its full nuclear arsenal. The peace talks would likely have focused on preventing such a catastrophic conflict from occurring again. Another possibility is the Americans would decide to push far east into Europe and even threaten Moscow. How that would play out would depend on how the Soviet leaders responded. Of course, if they were able to, they might have escalated. However, I do think there's a chance that they might have accepted that they were beaten and backed down. Potentially, if the conflict had lasted years, their military might have been degraded so much that they wouldn't have been able to keep fighting. In the negotiation that followed, America would almost certainly have demanded that they leave Eastern Europe. A final way that things might have played out would be if the Soviet Union was very successful initially and managed to occupy Western Europe. That would have made it much harder for the Americans to launch a counteroffensive, and potentially they would have agreed to a ceasefire. The Soviet Union would probably have remained in control of Western Europe, although America wouldn't have recognized it. Now let's imagine that the two sides never actually managed to de-escalate and that the situation got completely out of control. The key difference with this scenario would be the use of large nuclear weapons, potentially aimed at cities. As I mentioned before, one way that could happen would be if NATO pushed east towards Russia and threatened Moscow. The Soviets would have had their backs to the wall and might have decided to do whatever it took to stop the NATO advance. Exactly what they would do would depend on what position they were in at the time. If they were able to, they might try to hit an American city. They might view that as the only way to dissuade the Americans from their advance on Moscow. Of course, the Americans might then respond in kind, destroying a Russian city to prevent the Russians from doing it again. Perhaps an even more likely scenario would be that the Americans would decide that they need to neutralize the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal as fast as possible. Having just had a city destroyed, I could imagine them deciding to do whatever it took to neutralize every Soviet nuclear weapon. They might launch hundreds or even thousands of large missiles towards the Soviet nuclear launch sites. In fact, the Americans did actually have a plan to destroy the Soviet Union's entire nuclear arsenal. It was made in 1956, at a time when the Americans had far more nuclear warheads and the Soviet Union still hadn't developed intercontinental missiles. The main priority of the plan was actually the Soviet Air Force, because at the time the main threat to America were the Soviet bombers. The document, called the Strategic Air Command Atomic Weapons Requirements Study for 1959, identified more than 1,000 airfields in the Soviet bloc, each one given a level of priority. However, the plan wasn't limited to just military targets. There was also a list of urban areas identified for quote-unquote systematic destruction. That included over 1,200 cities in the Soviet bloc, from East Germany to China, again with each one given a level of priority. Moscow and Leningrad were given priority 1 and 2 respectively. The authors of the report did actually acknowledge the unimaginable destruction of the plan, including to civilians and friendly forces. To achieve the most devastating effects, the plan called for the nuclear bombs to explode at ground level rather than in the air, maximizing blast damage. The weapons would be delivered by bombers based in the United Kingdom, Spain and Morocco, and also ground-launched missiles. Now, it's important to make clear that there is a big difference between a plan being made versus having the intent to use it. In fact, it's not even clear how much adoption it had in the American government or military. That said, it does give a good picture of how a total escalation scenario might have looked. We don't know of a similar Soviet plan, but we can be pretty sure that they would have had one. It would also have included thousands of warheads striking both military and civilian targets. It would probably have included American allies like South Korea or Japan. Overall, I think if there was a full-blown nuclear war, it would most likely have happened because one of the two powers tried to totally destroy the other's nuclear capacity. The other would then retaliate if they were able to. Needless to say, the destruction would be unimaginable. In fact, an analysis by a team at Princeton estimated that in such a war, about 100 million people would die in the first 24 hours. As time went on, the total losses could get into the billions. All that raises the question, what would that actually have meant for humanity? If there were a full-blown nuclear war with entire cities being flattened, what would have happened to the world? It is sometimes said that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came close to ending, but is that true? Could humanity have actually gone extinct? And if so, how bad would the war have had to be? I'd like to consider two things that could have been an existential threat to humanity: global radiation poisoning and a potential nuclear winter. First, let's talk about whether radiation poisoning could have led to human extinction. Nuclear weapons produce radioactive material that in turn produces radiation. That radiation can be lethal in high enough doses. It breaks chemical bonds in cells, damaging them and leaving them unable to function. People exposed to enough radiation can die in a matter of hours, while lower levels can increase a person's chances of getting cancer or other diseases. So, could a nuclear war cause everyone to die in such a way? The short answer is no. It would be very unlikely for global radiation poisoning to kill every human being, even if hundreds or even thousands of nuclear bombs were detonated. That is because, for the most part, nuclear weapons produce radioactive material that decays quickly. Those close to the blast would be affected, but the majority of the radioactive material wouldn't last for long enough to travel far. That said, there would be some lighter particles that could reach the stratosphere and circulate globally. They would be carried by high-altitude wind currents, potentially spreading radiation over large areas, maybe even whole continents. That would increase radiation levels worldwide, but it probably wouldn't make the whole planet uninhabitable. Now let's talk about the threat of a nuclear winter. A nuclear winter is a theoretical environmental disaster that would follow a large-scale nuclear war. When a nuclear bomb detonates, it throws up vast amounts of dust and smoke, especially if detonated at ground level. A large nuclear bomb can release about 1 million tons of dust, and if multiple bombs exploded, there could be enough debris to block sunlight for an extended period of time. In the areas close to the blasts, that could lead to a cooling effect that could lower the temperatures by as much as 10 to 20 degrees for at least a year. There would also be global effects. The temperature of the whole world might drop by about 2 degrees for 1 to 2 decades. That would be enough to cause crop failures and lead to an enormous planet-wide famine. What exactly that would mean for humanity is hard to know. Total extinction is unlikely, but it could lead to the collapse of civilization. Obviously, one of the most important questions is how many nuclear warheads would need to go off to cause a nuclear winter. That is still hotly debated, but some studies suggest that as few as 100 nuclear explosions would be enough. It would actually depend on where the nuclear bombs exploded. Some targets, like oil refineries or cities, would actually produce thicker, darker smoke that would block more sunlight. A large nuclear war with thousands of explosions would almost certainly cause a nuclear winter. So, how to sum up? Overall, we can't know how things would have played out if the Cold War had turned hot, but we should definitely be grateful that it didn't. I do think that a full-on nuclear war and mass bombing of cities would have been unlikely, and that probably the two superpowers would have been able to keep the conflict relatively contained. I think the chance that it would have caused human extinction was fairly low. It wasn't in anyone's interest to have a major war, and both superpowers would have suffered huge damage. The pressure to de-escalate would have been overwhelming. That said, I can think of many times in history when humanity has done profoundly destructive things. A good example is World War I. There were no winners from World War I. Tens of millions of men died, and 4 empires collapsed as a result. I would argue that Europe's leaders didn't actually want the war to happen, and yet, once the process of escalation had started, they found themselves powerless to stop it. They were passengers on a train that they were unable to get off. Perhaps then, just because it wasn't in anyone's interests for the Cold War to go nuclear doesn't actually mean that much. Perhaps, once again, humanity would have found itself in an escalation that couldn't be stopped, but this time the stakes would have been just a little bit higher.